Literally in that context, there's nothing you could do but try and see what sticks. There was no thinking. There was just try, 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 works, keep trying. Not a lot of people are worried, are focusing on, that I think we should be focusing on, is what the medical profession is calling the fourth wave, or the fourth order. The fourth wave is being called the tsunami. Gaming was much bigger in kind of South Korea and places like that than here. There's a game called Lineage, and then World of Warcraft took out here. But some of those economies, like the currency inside those environments, one of them got to be as big as the GDP of Russia. The two driving forces in the last cycle, the last 70-year cycle, were democracy, right, with the falling of the Berlin Wall, and capitalism.
आज की ताज़ा खबर। बेंगलुरु में रहने वाले लू और अमेरिका में रहने वाले सिड आपसे कुछ बात करना चाहते हैं। संगीतकार राजेश के साथ आपका स्वागत है लूसिड में।
What's going on, people? My name is Sid, and welcome back to another episode of Lucid. On this episode, we have a really curious and fascinating professor, Professor Tony O Driscoll. He is a strategy and marketing professor at Duke, and I'm always inspired by his curiosity, and it was because of him I discovered my curiosity. On this episode, we talk about the different types of thinking and dive deep into each of them. We also talk about the rate of change of innovation cycles and whether governments can keep up. We also talk about, is there a possibility of digital countries? And finally, we talk about the future of Metaverse. I really enjoyed this episode and I hope you do too. And please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you. Professor, I just want to get right into it. I think I want to start off with this particular question where, as a kid, when I was growing up, I thought studying would make me smart, and IQ was the only parameter where I was judging people or comparing myself with. And then as I grew up, I got to know another term called EQ, emotional quotient. Recently, I've been, hearing a lot about first principles thinking, critical thinking, systems thinking. What is your take on this? Like, what is the difference between, like, say, critical thinking versus systems thinking?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, IQ, EQ, and Bill Boulding, my good friend, the dean at Fuqua, also talks about DQ, decency quotient. Yeah, I think I have language that I've kind of developed over time, Dikshit, called clean thinking, right?
Right.
So and the way I define that is thinking away the stuff that doesn't matter to leave the residue that really does matter. Or sometimes I talk about it as the simplicity that's on the other side of complexity. And whatever you do
Right.
in whatever job you're in, I think that clean thinking really matters. Now, in some instances, that can be systems thinking. The way you have to think kind of depends on the context you're operating in. If you're operating in a predictable context where the rules are known and it's very axiomatic, like those of us who have engineering backgrounds. I mean, that's how science works. Is you build a heuristic or an abstraction of reality that is dependable, reliable, valid, consistent over time. Gravity is 9.8 meters per second. And then you apply rigor and discipline around axioms and equations to get a repetitive outcome. And one of the things that I think engineers learn that is very valuable is the rigor of bottoming things out, the rigor of
Right.
doing the work all the way from the kind of problem statement through the calculus, through the algebra to the answer, if you know
Right.
what I mean. I think something that then becomes a challenge for engineers, speaking for myself, but also working with students, engineering students, is the rigor is great, but then letting go of that rigor and applying the rigor on abstract
Right.
situations. Now that's where you start to get into systems dynamics. So that's where you have feedback loops, and to understand systems thinking, you kind of really need to understand feedback loops that are reinforcing, feedback loops that are balancing, and also the
Right.
function of delay. and delay is the hardest thing to do. So there's a whole language around systems thinking where you can describe common patterns, things like tragedy of the commons or limits to growth and so on and so forth. And that's a lens through which I was just trained in that. Funnily enough, I was trained in that as an engineer because I was an electronics engineer. And so,
Right.
so
Yeah.
there's mathematics around this for power systems so that they don't blow up. But it's very much the
Right.
same way of thinking with systems thinking with the systems loop diagrams that Forrester from MIT, I think Harvard or MIT, and then popularized perhaps a little bit more with Peter Senge and others to literally map out the systems dynamic and what's going on. First principles thinking, probably mostly attributed to the kind of Musk and how Elon Musk and how he thinks is kind of he's a physics oriented guy, right? So similar to what I said
Right.
about science, but it's kind of like it's really breaking things down. Breaking things down to first principles, and in fact, I just recently saw, or maybe I was at a conference where he was speaking, and he was talking about this, and he's like, at the end of the day, if you had to pick one discipline, it's probably physics, because physics is he knows a lot about a lot, but he said physics is kind of his core,
Right.
and that's getting down to first principles, axioms. Now you have to weigh that. I guess what I'm trying to say is, depending on the context you're in, you have to invoke a different way of thinking. So depending on the context you're in, first principles thinking can be really good,
Right.
but also then, in a dynamic context, you might want to think about systems thinking. Then critical thinking is essentially it's almost like the dialectic, Hegelian dialectic. So you almost want to in that way of thinking, you want to remain open, but you also want to almost argue for the devil's advocate. You want to take the opposite position, or you want to take the
Right.
counterfactual position, and
Right.
play that one out. Because if you're in a kind of a dynamic and unpredictable type world, you have to kind of think about not first principles thinking like going down to the metal, so to speak, but first, second, third, and fourth order effects. So what are the
Right.
waves? I'll give you an example of that. When we talk about COVID today, right? The first wave of COVID was essentially when we got hit by the pandemic, and our medical systems weren't designed to deal with that, and so we didn't have
Correct. Yeah.
ventilators, and people died. The second wave that hit the medical system was all the people who had chronic conditions, who were not able to go to the hospital when it was being absorbed by COVID. And then the third wave was the people with kind of acute conditions, but less serious. They were chronic, continuous conditions. And so the medical system kind of got hit with three waves of surges of demand. That's a first, second, and third order effect, if you will, of COVID. The fourth order
Right.
effect, which is one that I think not a lot of people are focusing on, that I think we should be focusing on, is what the medical profession is calling the fourth wave, or the fourth order effect. And the fourth wave is being called the tsunami of medical
Okay.
maladies, of mental maladies. Is that
Right.
everybody on the planet went through some kind of existential threat, challenge, concern, worry, however you want to call it. And we're only starting to see now how big that
Right.
next wave is going to be, and it's also going to hit the medical system. So that's another way of thinking, is thinking in terms of waves, and how a particular decision you take will ripple through the system. Complexity theory is yet another way to think about things, and decision making in different environments. If you want to think about now, there's thinking, and then there's deciding. But thinking is to help you decide, right? The thing we have to worry about with complexity is that is Einstein's requisite law of complexity. When things are complex and there's system dynamics, like we talked about, you can't break the problem down below the level of complexity of the system. If that makes sense.
Right.
So you sometimes we want to oversimplify things, and then we solve it at a level of complexity below what the real level of complexity of the situation is, and then you
Correct.
don't get a good solution, because we haven't honored the complexity that's in that environment. So number
Right.
one is understand the context that you're in. And then number two is bring these different ways of thinking, and arguably two or three of them, diversity of perspective
Right.
and how you look at things, to kind of frame the challenge that you're working in. I have a model that I developed some time ago now. When organizations were having to deal with this, technology came along, cycle times get faster, things are more connected, things become more
Right.
unpredictable, and it's called perceiving, sense making, and choreography. Perceiving is seeing the problem with fresh eyes through different lenses. How do I frame the
Right.
particular issue? And there's a lot of errors in how we frame the issues. Typically, we tend to want to oversimplify it, and then when we solve for the oversimplified breakdown, it doesn't resolve. You don't get the outcome you're looking for. Sense making then is trying to use those different frames to understand what's truly going on. In some cases that's a
Right.
root cause analysis. In other cases it's a n order effect analysis. In others, it might be a systems dynamic analysis. But the goal there is to really identify, I call it WMM, what matters most. What's the smallest movement that will have the most disproportionate leverage on the outcome you're looking for, right?
Right.
And then thirdly is choreography, because the nature of problems today is multidisciplinary, and so in an organization context, which is what I teach, business stuff, organizations are organized into functions, and most of the solutions don't organize into functions. They're multidisciplinary, and so you have to learn how to orchestrate or coordinate across multiple different silos within the organization in order to get it to do
Correct.
what it needs to do. So perceiving, sense making, choreography. Understanding the perceiving is about understanding the nature of the context you're in. Sense
Right.
making is about using those different kinds of thinking, whether it's critical or systems or so on and so forth. And then choreography is kind of bringing to bear the right resources and capabilities to address the issue as you have hopefully accurately defined it. I don't know if that,
I think
does that make sense?
from what you shared, the main thing I think people miss is the
Yeah,
context,
that's
right?
right.
Like, how do you use this particular type of thinking in this particular context? So, can you talk more about like what do you mean by context? Is it like engineering versus business, people versus technology? How does like what kind of context are we talking about here?
So there's another model I developed that is about kind of trying to parse the context. So in the world we live in today, I'm more now. I'm in the domain of business and decision making rather than the domain of philosophy. Like we get lost
Right.
in philosophy for right.
Yeah.
We'll pull back out of that and just look at business. So there's a x-axis I use that is certainty of outcome. If I pull this lever, that light will turn on, and if I pull this lever 100 times, the light will turn on 100 times. So outcome predictability
Right.
is really high, and then environmental certainty is really high. I know exactly what's going on, and I know which lever to pull to get that outcome. So one is kind of what
Right.
buttons or levers do I pull or push, and knowing which ones to pull or push, that's environment. And then outcome is I know exactly cause and effect on what
What
I
is
do,
coming up?
right? Turn this knob,
Right.
pull this lever, always get that particular outcome. In a mechanical, engineering oriented type of world, outcome predictability high, environmental certainty super high. Do this, get
Right.
that. Cause and effect, tightly linked, and repeat.
True.
The only problem is that the world is not that way most of the time. Of course, if you're going to build a bridge, you're going to build a bridge, and we have figured out this is the thing with physics. I mean, we have Newtonian physics and we know how to build bridges, but then we have quantum physics and we know how to look at at
Right.
that level. But both of those actually, there's not a theory that kind of pulls them all together. Everyone's trying to find this physical. So there's ways that we can explain things at different dimensions. But this is the one. This is the one challenges. I mean, I suppose we'd have to go into a little bit of philosophy here. So before we had science and before we had the Enlightenment, we dealt with faith, religion.
Correct. Yeah.
It was a god or some extra, something beyond
Some
humans.
deity. Yes. Yeah.
Inshallah. In the Islamic tradition is God willing. In the Christian
Yeah.
faith, polytheistic faith as well. That there's something otherworldly that
Yeah.
determines, and you're more fatalistic. It's just hey, and then the scientific revolution comes along, the Enlightenment comes along and says no, through science we can prove things are true. Now that's a challenge in and of itself. So you can definitely prove things. Gravity is 9.8 meters per second, and the scientific methods allows us to understand those things. But
Correct.
in the whole universe that is life, science can probably explain
True.
0.0000001% of that, because uh, I don't know how to prove that my wife loves me.
Yeah,
Do you know what I'm trying to
exactly. Yeah.
say? So there's a lot of things
Human
now.
behavior.
Now I do believe that. So
Yeah.
that's a truth, but it's not a provable truth. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Scientifically. So sometimes I think we over rotate on trying to use science to. The tool of
Prove
science
things.
is not suited to the kind of question we're trying to solve as it relates to truth. So we had the we had kind of faith and belief, and then we had science, and then we had the post rationalist kind of world where it's like, no, everything is just kind of subjective. So that's kind of the
Mm.
postmodern world, and now I think we're moving to something that we call metamodern, which kind of says
Right.
we actually there's some things that are just belief based and can't be proven.
Mm.
There's some things that can be proven, and there's some things that are truly subjective, and depending again on the context that you're operating in,
Correct.
one or other of those might work. It's not right or wrong. It's what is the context. And now on context, I call that the X factor. So my one liner on that is content is king. Here's the content for
Mm.
strategy, Deekshit. Here's the content for transform. Regurgitate the frameworks
Correct.
to me, Deekshit. Let's make sure you get a good A on the test.
Right.
That has actually very little to do with your success in business. The real success
Mm.
in business, I think, is discernment and knowing how to perceive,
Mm-hmm.
sense, make, and choreograph, and knowing how to work with and through people. Because at the end of the
Right.
day, organizations are nothing but people. Now, all those frameworks and everything you learn in MBA school or business school are very helpful. Knowing the language is helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing the mechanics of how business create profit is helpful. But all of that kind of pales in significance compared to what you said, just before we came on the air here, is that the leadership management course was the one that was a real eye opener for you. And I would argue,
Yeah.
as you go on in your career, that'll be the one that will probably stay with you the most. The rest are, as somebody who teaches strategy, marketing, I mean, I do a lot of work in leadership outside of the school. I don't teach that per se at the school. But I think
Right.
that's the one that separates those who succeed from those who don't. Technical knowledge is kind of relatively easily acquired, but
Mm.
human relational knowledge is kind of, you can get the theory, but then you actually have to practice it, and you have to get good at practicing it. So yeah, that's a whole nother thing. If you, are you dealing with inanimate objects, or are you dealing
Yeah.
with animate objects, or are you dealing with sentient beings who are self-aware?
Right.
Then this is the one thing is humans, as we were just talking about before we came on the air, are predictably or irrational, as Dan would say. That
Irrational. Yes.
we do not operate as rational actors.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of economics is predicated on this notion that we're rational actors, and
Mm.
that we will, it's self interest, that we act in our own self interest. And if you stand back and think about it, anybody who's a parent who has a child is very rarely acting in their own self interest. They're acting in the interest of their children. They sacrifice in the
True.
interest of their children. Many
Yeah.
kids who come to Duke, their parents have toiled for 30 years or whatever it is to pay
True.
for their kids to go. That's not self-interest. That's other.
Yeah.
So I think there's a fair there are some underlying assumptions to traditional economic theory that perhaps should be questions at that assumption level. Do we have the context
Mm.
right? If and this is the
Correct.
thing with models. Models, by definition, are abstractions of reality. So the goal as an academic or a theory builder is to try to build a model that accurately represents what's going on, but simplifies it enough that we can get some predictability to it. But by definition, anytime you're doing that, you're abstracting it away. And the closer we get to a more generalizable model, the further we are from the context. You see
Correct.
what I'm saying? So this is a bit of a
Yeah.
paradox, right? So
Mm.
kind of go from a heuristic to an algorithm. This is why we're trying to get into AI and how does it all work? Um, so and then we could go into all that with the tech and the AI and what's the human machine interface going to look like? GPT-3. Well,
Yeah.
now a lot of us in the field have known about GPT-3 for a long time, but I guess Chat GPT is blowing people's
Is the
minds
new
and saying, "Oh
one.
my gosh, nobody's ever going to have to write an essay for college anymore." And how are we
Yep.
going? And then the question is, "Oh, how are we going to stop people cheating?" And I'm going, "That's the wrong question. The question is, here's
Yeah.
a tool that businesses are definitely going to use.
Use.
So how do we teach leaders and managers to work with this new technological affordance so that the
Technology, yeah.
organization can do better. Because I don't know any executive out there who's going to say, "I'm sorry, we're not allowed to use that." That's they, of course, they're going to use it, right? So anyway,
That's true. I think, as you said, like with respect to taking a complex theory and like simplifying it,
mhm,
right? And you said like there are like some complex things that you can't oversimplify
mhm,
it because then the solutions you get out of it are wrong.
mhm.
So how do you know like this is the point where I should stop simplifying a complex system?
Well, a lot of times, so my observation in that is, if you go back to this outcome and environment, outcome, the certainty of the outcome, the predictability of the outcome, and the kind of ability to manipulate the environment, right?
Right.
My observation is as follows: that I can't give you empirical numbers, but I would say more often than not, when people are faced with a problem, they tend to want to break it down into pieces. That's what we're all taught, is just
Right.
break it down, right?
Yep.
So inherent in that very initial thing is to break it down is to assume that it's ultimately a simple solution. Right.
Correct.
So I
Yeah.
would say more often than not, we underestimate the complexity of the situation we're currently dealing. And
Right.
secondly, then the second, so that's what I call a type one error. Type one error is misdiagnosing the context. And when I
Right.
use that now, I'm asking about the level of complexity to the context. So is it a simple context? Is it a complicated context? Is it a
Right.
complex context, or is it a chaotic context? Those are the four
Right.
rough, the many other academics have kind of identified those areas. Many. Dave Snowden would be one you probably ran into his work in decision making. And each one of those is like a different context that requires different approaches to deal with it. When Rudy Giuliani was the mayor of New York, it seems like an eternity ago now, given all the news that's been going on about him. He was the mayor of New York during 9/11. And in 9/11, nobody had really been in the position of being a mayor where that had happened and people
Correct.
dying and so on and so forth. And
Yeah.
literally in that context, there's nothing you could do but try and see what sticked. There was no thinking. There was just
Reference.
try, works, keep trying. That's a
Right.
very different model than build. You don't want to build a bridge that way. But
Correct.
in this
That's
particular
true.
instance, the context is totally chaotic. And in a context, in a chaotic context, all you can do is try. And if it at first it succeeds, keep trying till it stops. And then ultimately you
Right.
might see patterns. And the idea is you want to you can look at that one of two ways. You can push through trial and error to the other side of that complexity, where the safe harbor is, or you can try to solve it to bring it back into the realm of the complex, and then bring it back into the realm of the complicated, and bring it back into the realm of the simple. So you can either look at it as a circular model, or look at it as kind of
Right.
coming up to the edge of chaos and then trying to bring it back from the brink.
Right.
So that's what I
Yeah,
mean
that
by
makes a lot of sense.
context. The context I really, when I'm talking about that, is what it's almost like when you're playing music. It's like, what key are we in? Are we in the simple key? Are we in the chaotic
Right.
key? Are we in the complex key? Or
Right.
are we in the complicated key?
Right. Yeah, I think that's very important. I think generally when we think about problems, even me, like when I think about a problem, I directly think about the problem, but I don't think about the context. Is it ambiguity? What I'm solving for? Is it complexity? I think once we think about that, it helps you give out an effective solution.
Right. Now, once you've done that one, I mean, I don't know how far you want to go into this, but
No,
this is
please go
what I
ahead.
mean by clean thinking. So that's the complexity axis. So to me, there's I've flipped now. I'm going into a different framework. So within the one framework, I'm now making one axis out of a matrix that I just showed you. But now, so
Right.
that matrix collapses into one axis, and that axis is the degree of complexity: simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic.
Right.
Now, the second factor that's bearing on that kind of has a bit of a loop or a cycle, is the rate of change. Now, I'm not talking about things speeding up. I'm talking about a change in the rate of change. So, distance to velocity
Right.
is the first derivative. Velocity is the first derivative of
Right.
distance. Okay, and then acceleration is the second derivative, of distance, or the first derivative of velocity.
Right.
And jerk is the third derivative, and snap is the fourth derivative, and crackle is the fifth derivative, and pop is the sixth derivative. And I'm not kidding about that. In physics, back to Musk again,
Right.
those are known. But it's the rate of change. It's you're going from speed to acceleration. Now, when you go from acceleration to jerk, the only people who've actually physically felt that are astronauts, because you hit hyperspace. You go beyond it.
Right.
You're deriving acceleration. You're going to the next level. So a lot of people are going, wow, things seem to go so fast. No, not only are things going fast, they are accelerating, and not only are they accelerating, they are jerking. So on the one axis, we've got a tendency for increased complexity, and on the other axis, we have a change in the rate of change. I don't just mean faster. Faster is just one thing. Faster means going from
Right.
faster to acceleration. But what I'm saying is there's actually 6 different degrees of the rate of change.
Right.
And when you're up at the top right-hand corner, things do pop. Snap, crackle, and pop, right? So we
Right.
tend to try to want to stay, in the jerk level, so to speak, right? And that, to me, measures something that is true uncertainty. That
Right.
you there's no predictability in which direction you should go in. So
Right.
if you're at chaos and if you're at chaos and you're at jerk,
And hyperspeed, it's going to be really hard.
yeah, and if you're in that kind of environment, it makes absolutely no sense to try to break the problem down. You have to live with the problem, because one of the problems with complexity is you are not removed from the situation. Your agency in the system changes the system. It's like Heisenberg, in Heisenberg's
Right.
uncertainty principle. In one instance, it's a wave, and in another instance, it's an electron kind of thing.
Correct.
And your very interaction with the system causes the system to change. So there's no stable axiom upon which to build it. Everything's kind of connected, and
Right.
it moves around. Now, there are ways to make sense of that, right? That's what I mean by sense making, but that would be more of a systems dynamic type model rather than a reductionist model.
Got it. And
Yeah.
the other question I had with this, the other axis of rate of change is you gave an example of the mayor of New York during the 2611 times. Could you give an example in the business context where it's a chaotic problem and the rate of change is so fast that businesses have to just live with it? Like any example like
Airbnb
that?
dealing with COVID-19. Their business model is
But
predicated on putting people into homes that they don't normally live in. It's a platform.
Right.
It's a
Right.
marketplace between hosts and guests.
Right.
And whatever their strategic plan was, normally if you look at a 10K report, they also talk about, contingencies and how might we worry. And, I work for many insurance companies, and there are all kinds of existential risks. There are these things called super volcanoes, and if one of them blows, then we're all screwed, kind of thing. If you go back now and you look at these 10K type of reports where you go under risk, they all kind of mention, yeah, there might be an epidemic, or we could deal with the
Correct.
super volcano. But it's kind of like the risk of that is, we want to call it out, but we haven't really kind of
Thinking
planned for
about
it.
it. Yeah.
And then it hits you right in the face. So I mean, something like COVID for business was accelerative for some. If you were in the
Right.
digital gaming business, like Epic here or EA or whatever,
Right.
well, you're rocking and rolling. If you're Netflix, you're rocking because consumption just went way up. But if you're in a
Right.
business where where hotels, so now you're in a context that's completely, the world literally shifted overnight, and doing what
True.
you did before wouldn't work.
It's not gonna work.
Right.
Yeah.
Because before you're like, where's the next hotel I'm going to open, and how do I promote it? Well, that's
Correct.
not the question you have to ask anymore, kind of thing. You see? So I think when we think about disruptive events, a lot of times, when we talk about creative destruction, Schumpeterian, back to economics, not Adam Smith's economics, but the Austrian economics, people like Schumpeter, who talk about they talk about creative destruction, that technology comes along and changes the rules, and that's a good thing, because in changing the rules, it kind of gets rid of the old and brings in the new. But that's creative destruction. Somebody got destroyed. Yeah, buggy whip manufacturers got destroyed by the automobile. It's not their fault, but
Right.
they were a support function to an industry that disappeared because there was a better, cheaper, faster way to do it with a new technology. We didn't know at the time that the stuff coming out the tailpipe of that new technology was going to kind of cause issues for our planet at that time, and that's another issue. So there you have a technological solution that's really cool, and we got these pistons that fire, and we got these little explosions going, and it's better than horses pooping on the street, so let's go ahead and do it.
Correct.
But here we are, whatever, 60, 80 years later, and we're starting to recognize that 26% of the kind of emissions that are pumping carbon up into the air come from that very.
Just because of the
Yeah. So
technology and
there would be like a
innovation.
fourth order effect of, can you
Right.
blame the engineer who came up with the technology? No,
Right.
they didn't.
And yeah, I think you spoke about chaos and innovation. And if you think about chaos and innovation right now, what you mentioned, right? Like, GPT-3, Chat GPT. As you said, like there are some people who think about, oh, there are going to be so many jobs that are going to go
Mm.
away. Only the top 1% of their field is going to be employed. Rest of them are going to be unemployed.
Mm.
What are your thoughts on ChatGPT? ChatGPT replacing search, ChatGPT accelerating people's jobs?
Well, I think for many years we've had issues about this. Sometimes we call this the Malthusian problem. Sometimes we call this the knowledge problem. But the basic thing is, the world is changing. Like the Malthusian, the first framing of this was Thomas Malthus, where he kind of basically said, "Oh my God, I've looked at the population and I've looked at our production for food, and we're going to starve. We're making too many humans, and we can't make enough food for the humans." But then technology came along, and only 2% of
Correct.
GDP is spent on agriculture today, but we had technology in seeds and irrigation
Correct.
and fertilizer and all that kind of stuff. But then, for people who know how to manipulate seeds, that's a new job. The job didn't previously exist, but now it exists.
Exist.
So I think
Right.
similar to I believe, like, I actually literally remember, because when I did my degree undergrad, it was the first year at Virginia Tech. That was 1985. Was the first year at Virginia Tech that they offered this thing called computer science. It was a new.
Correct.
You see what I'm saying? And now, I mean, Silicon Valley has all these people who have degrees in this thing called computer science. 60 years ago, that wasn't a thing. So
Right.
I think in 60 years from now, and when there'll be a whole building on the Duke campus that has a name that
Right.
neither you or I could pronounce or even understand what it is, and it'll be core to the running of the new model for business at that point in time. I think
Right.
generically speaking, this is definitely, from my perspective, a technological inflection point that's quite big. Now, there's a lot more to talk about in this, in terms of just kind of economic theory and Schumpeterian creative destruction. But basically, the way things work goes like follows. You get a breakthrough in technology, and that breakthrough in technology, let's just take it, because I know we're going to go there. So let's say, whatever, Tesla or Facebook or something.
Right.
Let's go with Zuckerberg, just for argument's sake, because I think you want to talk about Tesla later. So Zuckerberg figures out this Facebook thing using this new technology, and it completely takes off. Now, when that technology takes off, it's taken off because we had an electrical infrastructure put in place, and then we had an internet infrastructure put in place, and then we had a mobile infrastructure put in place. So that there's all these layers of infrastructure that kind of allowed him to do that. And then he came up with this technology, and then like 4 billion people are now currently using it, or maybe not now, but I mean, 6 months ago, whatever. Uh, and what happens is, people invested in Facebook. So people who have wealth above wage, who invest
Right.
in the stock market, they make a whole ton of cash off that. Right? I
Correct.
invest, if everyone's like, wow, if you bought a share of Apple when Steve Jobs came back, you could be
Yeah.
retiring right now. Well, the
Right.
average person doesn't. That's what economists like Carlotta Perez call it's a casino economy. You're making money from money. It's money on money returns. Does that make
Correct.
sense?
Yeah.
So yes, you're investing in the stock. You're looking to get a gain from the stock, but your motivation in investing in the stock is to make money. And so sometimes one of the issues, I think, with the stock market today is that it too has become technology driven, right?
Orient. Yeah.
So now, the whole Robin Hood thing and everything else, day trading is up. Uh, Essentially, you're just looking at algorithms and patterns. I know a bunch of day traders;
Right.
they literally don't know what company they're buying. It's just that the pattern
True.
hit, and you want to
Pattern.
buy, and 10 minutes later you'll sell and you make money. So it used to be in the old days with the likes of Warren Buffett, they were value based investors where they'd look at a company and they'd say, will this company be 10 times better 10 years from now than it is now? And that would be a good company. They were value based investment. And so then there was probably a tighter correlation between the business strategy and the profitability of the business and the competitive landscape, all the things we talk about in strategy, and what the stock price is. I actually think those two have become way more decoupled of late because the people playing the stock market are playing it for financial gain. They're not necessarily, it's not a real way of recognizing the company. Like the variance in how well a stock price says how good a company is going to going how long it's going to last is I think less precise today than it was before.
Right.
So what happens is with a new technology like the steam engine, everybody invests in the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and so on and so forth, and they become incredibly wealthy, and those who invest in them become incredibly wealthy. But those who have not had the opportunity to benefit from that, you get a Gini coefficient goes up, so that the wealthy become wealthier, and the less wealthy become
Correct.
become pissed off, and then you have revolutions, right? And
Correct.
so you can follow these curves of when a new seismic technology comes out, electricity, oil, the internal combustion engine, the internet, right? And we are at an inflection point right now, particularly if you look at Carlota Perez, where essentially this next level of technology, in the past you could look at these and these technology cycles ran every 70 years. Well, now we've had the internet, we've
And
had
it's
mobile,
reducing.
we've had social, we've now got AI, ML AI, we've got blockchain, we've got, in other words, we used to have a 70-year cycle of these truly transformational technologies hitting
Correct.
us. And then we kind of had
Yeah.
a 70-year period to figure it out, because what happens is the technology comes, creates this gap, people get mad, and then you need to innovate from a society perspective. So, for instance, during the Industrial Revolution, when we learned how to make machines, right, using coal first and then electricity for machines, so no more muscles, just actually machines, the government needs to implement child labor laws. We didn't need child labor laws before, but now when factories are
The machines
literally
came back.
using
Yeah.
children, then we needed that, or we needed, for instance, after the Second World War, the U.S. government implemented the whole idea of home ownership and putting mortgages in place to where you could borrow to buy a home. That was very deliberate. That was coming out of World War II. So what you need is kind of policy innovation to redistribute this inequality in wealth that comes from tech bubbles. So tech bubbles do
Right.
this. That's what they do. It's just by definition, and they run until they break,
Right.
and then they bust, and
And
then
then
you
they.
have to have innovation policy on the other side to solve the technical. It's almost like you're having to deal with the second and third order effects that we didn't realize. Similarly with the
Correct.
automobile now, we
Right.
didn't realize the carbon emissions, but now we're having to deal with what are we going to do? And someone like Musk comes along and tries to solve it with the cars.
Right.
So the problem today is that the number of truly transformative technologies that are coming within the next 10 years we've never seen before, and the ability for us to innovate from a societal perspective to address that is quite challenging,
Yeah.
because these are global issues, global warming.
Correct.
You see what I'm trying to say? But there's no
Yeah.
jurisdiction that's global.
Yeah.
You
Exactly.
know what I
Yeah.
mean? So if America says, "Yeah, I don't want to do whatever the Paris Accord Treaty," or China,
Correct.
or India for that matter,
Yeah.
because I'm Modi or I'm whomever, and I'm not going to do that. Well, then the world suffers, but there's no jurisdiction above that. There's no world
Right.
jurisdiction, and
Correct.
all of the institutions that were put in after World War II, like IMF, World Bank, United Nations, and all that. They're they're discursive bodies. They don't have teeth. They can suggest, but as things stand today, we have nation states with
Right.
either whatever democratically elected leaders or not. It doesn't really matter, to be honest. But they're gonna look after their own interests or their country's interests. But the nature of the problems we tend to be dealing with right now, the grand
Is
challenges, are
global.
global. And so the first
Yeah.
thing we have to get our head around is how do we actually think about innovating policy at a global level? Or some people
Yeah.
say, no, you don't do it at a global level, and you don't do it at a national level. You should do it at the city level. So there's a lot. I teach, as you know, a class in kind of global markets and institutions, and those are a lot of the
Yeah.
issues that we try to think about is what kind of institutional innovation would be required to address problems as complex and important as global warming or
Correct.
AI.
Yeah. I think, like as you said, right? Like previously, the innovation cycles were like at least 70
Yeah.
years. So the governments could experiment, see if like some policies are working or not, and then like come to a stable policy.
Hmm.
But with so many technologies that are coming up, and like I don't think like the government is that equipped, or they don't get the right resources to invest into it to come up with great policies. And the other thing is also about the chaos, right? Like in terms of like, let's look at Web3. There's like so many things going on with respect to crypto and blockchain. Like the governments don't have time to break down the problem and solve for it, because they have to first, they're more reactive right now.
Right. So you've
So
got you've got kind of the Silicon Valley or the Bangalore or the Shenzhen. Like we got all these kind
yeah.
of or Haifa in Israel. We got these kind of innovation hubs, if you will. Silicon Valley, 138
Yep.
corridor, Austin here. And they are awash in cash from the last wave of infusion of money,
Exactly.
right? The Googles of the world, great fun being
Yeah.
Google X. You got more money than God to go play with stuff. And they're kicking
Yes.
out technologies because that's what they do.
True.
And then you've got organizations, you've got companies, multinational organizations who essentially work around the clock. Their workforce is
Correct.
global, and the work just kind of circumnavigates the globe where the sun is shining. So they never stop
Correct.
working. So they understand how to work globally. They also understand how to take advantage of different political policy regulations.
Correct.
Ireland, my own country, where I come from,
Hmm.
they had very, very low corporate tax. And so most companies would choose to headquarter there because they will pay less
There. Yeah.
tax. So
Yes.
companies are very savvy at working in a global context, but countries
Correct.
aren't because they're not
Yep.
global. So
True.
we got these disconnects, right? We got the technology crowd who've got more money than God, and they're just off doing what they're going to do, which is why we're seeing all this new waves of technology coming, and there's not a lot of people, I think, pausing to ask, like, oh my
Right.
gosh, we haven't even got, can we even get social media back in the box? And now we're going to do blockchain and metaverse and like, hold on
Yes.
a sec. But here's the thing, that's not going to stop. Technology marches forward irrespective. Yeah,
Irrespective.
so
Yep.
that's
Yes.
that's just an unyielding march forward. It waits for nothing.
Yeah.
And then you've got, you're right. I think governments that kind of, number one, going back to self-interest. I mean, largely either the person who is in an autocratic regime has their own self-interest,
Right.
and will make their decisions on the nation's behalf that way, or through some kind of democratic process, which that's also kind
Right.
of democracy doesn't really work when you got two parties because it just creates polarity. But I think, and
Yeah.
nor does it work in your country where you got like 47 parties.
Yep.
There's some I don't know, 3 to 9 or something like that, where that kind of
Right.
democratic part. So literally, I think the two driving forces in the last cycle, the last 70-year cycle, were democracy, right, with the falling of the
Correct.
Berlin Wall, and capitalism.
Correct.
And it's almost today, both of those models are actually running out of gas, almost pun intended. They're kind of they're hitting an impasse to where they
Yeah.
can't necessarily, the capitalist model. You just It's very clear. Roger Martin has a really good book. More is not enough kind of thing, or more is not better. That's right. That's what it's called.
Okay.
And basically, he goes through an economic analysis and said in 1978, that's where things went from being a regular Gaussian distribution to a parallel distribution, and that the wealthy
Right.
get wealthier. And at 78, he's got a very nice analysis of how this happens, and a lot of that has to do with technology, because we removed a lot of friction in the system, and then wealth accrued to those who own the new system, and even if you
Right.
look at that today, right? The seven of the 10 largest companies, market capitalization, this is stock price, right? And their capitalization is insane because of what I told you about earlier with the kind of irrationality of the market. They're platform companies.
Yep.
They used to be oil companies,
Like
and
take
now they're
Apple for
platform
example.
companies. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So Apple has sat, sometimes at a $3 trillion valuation.
Yep.
That means that people, well, what that used to mean, if you were kind of more of like a Warren Buffett value-based investor, is I don't know what their earnings are, but basically all those earning multiples are out the door now because it's like $3 trillion. That means we think that they're going to make like whatever, 10 new innovations like what they did with the phone and so on
Yep.
and so forth. And it's kind of like, well, where are they going to come from? I'm
Yeah.
not. It's not a knock on Apple. I'm just saying that it's almost like the market expectations are pretty unrealistic.
It's really
You
high.
know what I
Yeah.
mean? In terms
Yep.
of what can happen. So the capitalist model, to a certain extent, is kind of its limitation is that it left to its own devices and driven by tech. You can even look at this perhaps a bit with crypto and how it's going up and down and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Let alone what went on with SB, whatever's on.
SBI. Yes.
There's challenges there. And then with the democracy, it's clear that we're seeing Freedom House and all these other things. Democracy is in retreat.
Right.
So we're seeing a lot more, and that's because well, in my opinion, that's because essentially in a democratic system, particularly when it falls down to just two, it's no longer about kind of a representation for the people that's keeping my seat, and then
True.
it just becomes very very conflictual,
Correct.
and therefore nothing moves forward. So you've got
Right.
technology moving at jerk rate and coming up with, you name it, GPT-3 this week
Yep.
and blockchain next week and who knows what the week
Next
after
week.
that,
Yes.
or the millisecond after that. You got
Right.
organizations who figured out how to work globally to maximize profitability by almost taking advantage of the slowness of government to respond. And then you've got problems that are at a global scale that individual countries are not even incented to solve. So therefore, what that actually means, in my opinion, and certainly in the opinion of those of us who teach at Duke, is that business can and must become more of a force for good in the world.
Right.
Business is probably better positioned to be able to deal with these complex global issues in partnership with government. But
Right.
and I think you're seeing this a little more with here in America, the Business Roundtable, and we want to move from shareholder value to stakeholder value, and a lot of
Right.
that's rhetoric at the moment. But I do feel, some of the underlying theory, the stuff we did in strategy with creating shared value, you need profit. You got to have profit to grow.
True.
I think there's opportunities there for business to do good and do well. And that I think the capabilities of business to drive innovation in the right direction, partnered with the
Right.
right kind of policy from government, we're going to have to see a lot more mixed coalitions that way, as opposed to traditional business leaders just hiding behind, all I have to do is deliver shareholder value. That's my job. And I
Right.
think I think the jury's in on that one at this point in time. That doesn't necessarily work.
Yeah. Before I get into that part of like companies need to look at as a force for good, one theory that my friend and I were talking about was like, as you said, companies are global, but countries solving problems are still national, right? Do you think will there be a point of time where countries might become digital?
Oh
Like
yeah.
you know about DAOs, decentralized
Oh
autonomous
yeah, yeah.
organizations,
DAOs,
digital
yeah,
coins.
or more. I would probably say the person who's advocating that particular position the most is Balaji Srinivasan, the
Yeah.
network state. So Balaji was
Yeah.
with, I think he was like the CTO of Coinbase, and he was with Andreessen Horowitz.
Yes.
Phenomenal, phenomenal intellect, very, very thoughtful, and really knows tech. And so for a long time, many other people have talked about this. Countries aren't stable either. By the way, there's I don't know. I was just looking at it today. I think there's 195 countries in the world, and the rules change. And so his concept is kind of, this actually happened some time ago. A while back, Zuckerberg was trying to release Libra. He was trying to create his own currency inside, and the idea there is that's the network state. So essentially, a way to think about it is the Catholic Church. Okay, so the Catholic Church is run out of Rome. It's got a whole set of rules and policies, and if you're a member of the Catholic Church, you could live in Ireland and you could be part of your parish, and you're an Irish
Right.
citizen and you pay taxes in Ireland, but you really
Correct.
mostly associate with,
With the Catholic
and
Church.
also with home base in Rome. But all up and down, mostly up in the Northeast here in the United States. There's more Catholics up there than not, right? And he's like, well, like, what if I'm in a network state of whatever, and I can live in India or I can live in America and whatnot, but
Right.
I run my life digitally in this world. And then you see places like Taiwan and Estonia who are kind of trying to say, yeah, digital passports and fungibility and moving through. It's not dissimilar to what you see in the metaverse now. With the metaverse, the whole idea is interoperability. I should be able to leave my
Correct.
Fortnite world with my identity and end up in Need for Speed. I'm just using two games
Right.
as an example there. But
Yeah.
if we're going to build the metaverse, then the fungibility of your identity and your credentials and your currency moving between worlds. It's kind of like going from Ireland to Great Britain, and Great Britain to, you used to have to change all your money, and then we came up with credit
Correct.
cards and so on and so forth. It's similar to that. And so I don't think that it's at all out of the realm of possibility that could happen.
But do you think governments will allow that? Like governments of the world, especially like say
Didn't you just tell me
China.
that governments are having a hard time figuring this out in the first place? I mean,
It is, but like imagine like something that's out of their control. Like this is gonna be run like on the blockchain. Like everything is by the people. There's no people that no government entity as
yeah.
such. So like, how do you think governments are gonna react if like something like this exists?
Well, I think things like this already exist and they're unaware. I mean, this is what I'm saying. It's just it's on a different plane. You know what I'm
Yeah,
trying to say? So
right.
like every kind of heuristic or rule base that you might choose, I mean, there's no jurisdiction now, right? I mean, from my
Correct.
perspective, technology companies, and it's not maliciously, but they've escaped regulatory capture. You
True.
know what I mean? It's kind of like, okay, so let's say, just imagine for a second that what Tristan Harris and others have been trying to push and say that social media truly, brings out the worst angels of our nature, and as
Correct.
Jonathan Haidt and all his work about just very specifically how Instagram, can have a very,
Correct.
very negative effect on teenage females, for instance. And so now the policy, the government in the United States decides, which I'm not saying it could happen, because one side's
Just
just going to want to do the
hypothetically.
opposite of what the other wants to do. But let's imagine that they got
Correct.
together and said, okay, we're gonna banish the advertising model on all social media platforms here in the United States. Okay. Well, oh my God, that's the end of the world for Facebook? No, it's not. There's
They're just
only
gonna change the
200 million
strategy.
users here. They got 4 billion worldwide. So yeah, it's a dent, maybe,
Correct.
if the enforceability of that could even happen. You see what I'm trying to
True.
say? So that's
Yeah.
what I mean by escaping regulatory capture. It's like, yeah, would that be big news in the United States? And the Congress has said, and blah 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 blah, and advertising is no longer allowed as a business model. It's kind of like you can't smoke anymore, whatever.
Correct.
Okay, great. There's 1.2 billion people smokers in China, so let's just kind of go there. You see what I'm trying to say? So
Yeah.
the digital stuff okay, just put the servers elsewhere. If the jurisdiction doesn't work there, and
Change the
right.
country, yeah.
So I
True.
kind of feel like I don't think that I think the emergence of something like what Balaji talks about with a network state, certainly if I was trying to handicap its likelihood happening, very low on my list would be kind of government intervention. I just don't feel that they've even got the radar to detect what's going on there, because it's not their thing.
Yeah, I think we can. You're talking about the metaverse,
Mm.
Facebook, Instagram, and I think in one of our classes you mentioned that hey, Meta is gonna be a little is late to the party. Like you thought they were gonna do it earlier. What do you think about Facebook's pivot to Meta and like focus on the metaverse?
Yeah. Well, so as you know, I did a lot of research into metaverse the last time when I was still at IBM, and I think, I mean, look, I spent 3 years in the metaverse back then, so I guess my opinion. I wrote a book on this stuff. My opinion kind of comes from having been there. I think it's very, very difficult for people to criticize something if they haven't experienced it. So that's one issue. Um, so back then, I actually was a big believer in the metaverse actually coming to fruition and adding a lot of value, and did some thoughtful analysis on how it could add value. But there were two technological impediments to
Right.
essentially being adopted. One was over the air bandwidth, and the other was in machine computation cycles. Both of those are no longer issues, particularly with
Right.
the arrival of 5G, right? And then obviously, this Mac today that I have compared to 10 years ago is just like it's like a supercomputer, right? So I think those technological hurdles have gone away. Now, the same. So now I'm going to flip on technology. So I talked about technology being a disruptor and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But there's a whole nother thing about kind of, you look at the management of technology and how you deal with it. And unfortunately, we all fall prey to something that Peter Drucker calls the routinization trap, which is we tend to take a radically new technology and use it to automate the past without
Right.
assumptions and all. So we don't look at the inherent affordances within the technology and ask how might it solve a
Correct.
big problem. We just say, "Oh, cool! This computer can calculate faster than us, so let's create a calculating machine so we can get rid of humans." You see what I'm trying to say?
Right.
So
Yeah.
so, so we try to automate,
The past actions. Yeah.
and then so it's almost like even today, if you look at Eric Schmidt, so he wrote a really good book with Kissinger recently on kind of where AI is going, right? And when Eric took over Google, he was kind of like, the adult in the room, not unlike perhaps Sheryl Sandberg in Facebook, and they were like, you know, once he saw the trend of mobile, it's like we need to be mobile first, right? And so kind of seeing on that trend, and technology, like I said, starts to iterate on top of itself. And if you have the kind of cash infusion coming in, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's going to happen. Now, with the metaverse, now I think with Web3, so with the blockchain underpinning,
Right.
and then I mean, if it's the same crowd of characters going round and round and round. So like the Web3 movement now with they're all essentially the original web people, but they're kind of saying essentially the internet got hijacked by these platforms. The internet used
Correct.
to be open, http://open.
Yep.
And then what we ended up getting was all these wall gardens, whether it was AOL or Facebook or whatnot.
Right.
It's kind of like they hijack the internet and want to command your attention to control your consumption kind of model, which is then predicated on the advertising model. So there's one thing that says get rid of the advertising model, and there's another thing that's like let's get the internet back to what it was,
Right.
HTTP to open, and then let's bolt a currency on the bottom of it using the ledger, right?
Correct.
So that we can literally lay claim to digital assets, my identity, currency, whatever that is.
Everything. Yeah.
So I think that the kind of the technological stars are lining up, no problem,
Right.
and we'll probably have network states.
Yep.
Maybe already have some.
Yes.
And that's going to be a very different world. I had a good friend of mine back 10 years ago was an economist, Ted Castronova, and he started to look at the economies of these gaming. Like gaming was much bigger in kind of South Korea and places like that than here. There was a game called Lineage, and then World of Warcraft took out here. But some of those economies, like the currency inside those environments, one of them got to be as big as the GDP of Russia.
Right.
Just these gaming environments, Fortnite, for instance. Just think about it, right?
Right.
How much people buying skins and so on and so forth. So I think we already have, if you will, network states. People who play Fortnite all around the world, or people who play Minecraft all around the world, and there's a currency and so on and so forth. So I can completely see that happening. Uh,
If you had to say like
but here's what
10
I'd say:
years.
I don't I feel with Zuckerberg and going in, he clearly invested a lot of money in Oculus. I think he
Correct.
kind of sees that. But my concern with that is if it becomes a 3D based Facebook advertising model, we're in trouble. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So on the one side you've got the old school open open internet pioneers like the likes of John Perry Barlow, who's no longer with us, but those kind of folks, right? Uh, they want the technology to come back to being completely open,
Right.
and then the blockchain stuff coming along to be completely transparent. It's like a trust
Right.
protocol. So the hope there is that open and trust, great.
Right.
We have that kind of system. However, on top of that platform, just like on top of the HTTP platform, if you put a 3D rather than 2D
Right.
social platform, and then its business model is advertising,
Right.
then I almost feel like we'll be worse off. Because
True.
today, at least, we spend some time in meat space.
Outside, yep.
But
And you're
then
gonna spend all your time
we
in the
literally will be,
yeah.
what's the one liner? If something is free, you're the product.
That is true.
And so I think our digital selves would essentially be kind of trapped in the wrong kind of metaverse. So
Yeah.
what do I think about Facebook? I think that he's a bold innovator. I think that he spent a lot of money. I think he had money to spend, but now you can see he's backing off, right? So
True.
just a fair amount of layoffs
Yeah.
on the meta side of things. And I think it'll take a while for the metaverse to sort itself out. I mean, Neil Stephenson came up with the term quite some time ago, and but to my way of thinking, it's definitely got some applicability, and it's just going to be plain better in some instances. And there will be people yet again who they'll be the next Rockefeller. They'll be the Rockefeller of the 3D blockchain-based network state.
Correct.
Yeah, and we'll be back into the same cycle again.
Same loop.
But the problem is the peak of that loop now, Deekshit, I worry about. Because it's not just electricity, or it's not just gasoline power, or it's not
Correct.
just the internet. It's now
Right.
the internet plus social plus mobile plus Web3 plus blockchain plus AI,
Right.
all coming
Together.
correct.
Yeah. I think
And one thing I can tell you is, if you go back to the very first matrix I shared with you,
correct.
predictability of outcome, close to zero. Environmental certainty, what button to push or pull, even
You
closer
don't
to
know
zero.
at all.
So we can't be reductionist in
Right.
you know what I mean. If ever there was a time to not fall prey to the law of requisite complexity, or to fall prey to the routinization trap, it's now. And yet, if history teaches us anything, that's what we tend to do. So
Right.
that's a problematic thing, just from a, which goes back to your first question. And it's funny, a lot of students ask me that. It's like, how do you think? It's more of an epistemological question. It's okay, great. What is strategy or marketing or any of that stuff? I mean, don't get me wrong, it's good stuff. But I actually think we kind of need a step change in sense making and how humanity makes sense of things. And I think that AI is going to have an important role to play in that.
Right.
I think that this argument about GPT-3 and oh my gosh, now kids are never going to write essays. It's like, I'm very glad that this thing didn't come out 6 months ago when my kid was writing college essays. Because
Yeah.
that's what's going to happen next year. And so the first reaction there is, how do we stop it? How do we get technology to stop GPT? I'm like, well, that's the biggest fool's errand you've ever seen. It's like, how do I get technology to stop blockchain? How do I? That's not going to happen. Okay.
Right.
So
That's
now,
true.
how do we embrace it? Because companies are going to take advantage of it. Companies are going
Correct.
to take advantage of the blockchain. Companies are going to take advantage of, there is value in it, right? So how do we teach people? Actually, teach is not the right word. How do we create the learning conditions within which people can come to understand how to deal with these complex situations?
Yep. I think that's the most important thing. Yeah.
Right.
That's true. But I can go on and on with you, Professor, but I think we are on time. So I'm going to end the podcast here with this
Okay.
amazing conversation.
I think we
Hopefully,
got
there's another
we
part
got through
two.
your first question, Deekshit.
Sorry?
I think we only got through your first question. I think,
Yes.
but that's okay. To be
Yes.
continued, maybe.
Yep. But yeah, thank you so much, Professor. Like I definitely enjoy all the conversations. This was one another one. So thank you so much.
when we talk about COVID today, the first wave of COVID was essentially when we got hit by the pandemic and our medical systems weren't designed to deal with that. And so we didn't have enough ventilators and people died. The second wave that hit the medical system was all the people who had chronic conditions who were not able to go to the hospital when it was being absorbed by COVID. And the third wave was the people with kind of acute conditions, less serious. They were chronic, continuous conditions. And so the medical system kind of got hit with three waves of surges of demand. That's a first, second, and third order effect, if you will, of COVID.